so the exec order on AI is pretty interesting. It makes for not very engaging bedtime reading, but there you go. How to look at it. There's some good intent with the executive order, but let me kind of try and dissect it a little bit more and kind of understand it in various ways that may or may not be practical. So the first thing about regulation, if we kind of think about why you regulate any industry, be it, drugs that need to have safety periods, be it a seatbelt in a car where you should wear it because it saves life, and that is in the good of humanity and humankind. So regulation, when you apply regulation, is important as a government. In the context of AI, it's important to remember that generative AI, which is this latest version of AI, is ultimately a tool. It's a tool for good or for not so good, nefarious purposes. So if we think about it in that context, the regulation is aiming to regulate the tool as opposed to the outcome. Now, could you use generative AI, and can you, for bad things? And as a bad actor, you can produce bad outcomes? Of course. And really, that's where I think the executive order has missed the mark slightly. It's focused on the method, the people, the process, as opposed to the outcomes. So let me give you an example of why this doesn't make sense, and maybe a similar situation going way back to the early days of the internet. In 1994, Netscape put out the first browser. And if you think about that, a browser had the possibility for being a force of good and a force of not so good outcomes. What are the not so good outcomes? You could have argued at the time, and if IBM had come along and argued, or anybody had argued, well, actually, you know what, a browser is a good thing, but actually it's got a lot of danger in it. There's nothing preventing somebody from using a browser to spread disinformation or to spread anti-Semitic information or far-right information, whatever it might be. And that could be a bad impact for any society. Therefore, we should regulate this browser thing. That's effectively what's going on with AI. We're regulating the tool, not the outcome. So this is why it's maybe just as well that we didn't regulate the browser. We didn't regulate the TV when it came out donkeys years ago. There were similar arguments by doomsayers who would say, look, it's going to have a really detrimental effect on the youth. It didn't in some ways, and sometimes it might have. It's the outcome. And that's really important. So when we think of the outcome, what can happen to regulate, or what should we be actually regulating? We should be looking at the effect, the impact. So if I use AI, generative AI, or indeed standard AI for nefarious activities, for activities that would be negative, that's the crime. That's the thing that should be regulated. And in many ways, it already is regulated in today's legislation. If I commit fraud and I happen to use generative AI to commit that fraud, I should be held up in a court of law for violating fraud legislation. So that's the first thing, the intent. Why are we doing it, and why are we looking to regulate a tool as opposed to the outcomes? And I'm scratching my head over that. I don't quite understand the necessity for that. The only thing I can say is that it is often the case where when entities, large entities, particularly big tech, seek for regulation, it may be that they're looking for a protectionist stance in the market that they have already a stance in. Quite possible. Now, the second thing about the executive order, if we think about it, and this is just specific, technical issues I have with it, is the exec order talks about watermarking content generated from a Gen AI standpoint. And watermarking, we're all kind of familiar with this from the point of view of, let's say you have a watermarked PDF file, which has a kind of a background image. And the intent of watermarking is very reasonable, which is to give 100% guarantee that what you're seeing derived from a certain context. All good. The issue with the way this thing is written is that it suggests that the people who wrote it don't actually understand how modern software is built. Most modern software is built by a mix of things. Generative AI is just one of these things. It's a mix of standard algorithms. It's a mix of traditional AI, because AI has been around for 40 plus years. So there's lots of AI. In fact, pretty much everything, including Netflix, anywhere else, you will see AI up the wazoo. It's all AI. Predicting what TV program you might like next or what music you might want to play next. That's AI. Generative AI is just an evolution of that. And it is a wonderful evolution that gives you much better outcomes and more efficiency, etc. But it's simply a mechanism to get a better outcome or to be more efficient. It in itself is not evil. It's not dangerous. So the watermarking element, how do you even detect whether something is actually created by AI? If I write a letter and I initially write it myself, and then I ask AI to help me crystallize my thoughts or summarize it or make it more punchy or make it more engaging. How much of the final product is AI or generative AI versus how much is me? It's very difficult to assess that. It may be 5%, it may be 2%, it may be 23%, who knows? And the core manufacturers of the large language models for which this legislation or this executive order applies have a similar challenge. How much of their stuff is generative AI? And how much of the model is impacted? Now, you've got a couple of other things in this executive order around the role of foreigners, non-US nationals, who are participating in creating the models. And on one hand, you've got the government saying that we want more, in the interest of diversity and equality, we want more non-nationals involved in technology. This hand, we're saying, actually, you know what? Anybody who's a non-US national who's engaged in creating this technology immediately makes you in contravention of the executive order. So there's a little bit of a mixed messaging going on there. Then the final point that I've kind of struck me about this whole thing is that the executive order talks about sizing and talks about kind of, putting a limit on, what constitutes something that's prone to this regulation or that needs to apply or this regulation applies to, and stuff that's it doesn't apply to. And it kind of reminds me, software and technology and the rate of progression of all this stuff moves so fast that what you thought was fast, 2 years ago or 5 years ago, suddenly is so out of date that it no longer applies. So the executive order is a little bit brittle, and it reminds me of back in the day, well, specifically when I was a youngster in my early career in tech. In 1993, I worked in a pretty large bank in Chicago, and we were writing systems, and those systems were designed to communicate. And we communicated at the lofty rate of 2400 baud. Now, I'm being a bit geeky here, but baud is a measurement bits per second. Effectively, that's 300 characters per second, which is really, it's ancient history at this point. And we used to use the old dial-up modems that some of you may remember, which were kind of those squeaky things with the Star Wars-y sounds coming out of them. And I have a feeling that we're trying to legislate today almost equivalent to that era. What we will have in play in 5 years' time, in 2 years' time, even in 1 year from now, is going to make what we currently have look like ancient history. So I just feel that the overall executive order, whilst its intent is very reasonable, it does mention things like, child protection issues. It does mention things around our own information and trustworthiness and hallucinations and so forth. But the implementation of it is going to cause more friction than it's worth. And ultimately, I do suspect it'll make the US less competitive than it otherwise would be.